Winter, 1945. Snow covered the barbed wire at Camp Hemer like ash settling after a long fire. Rows of German prisoners stood in silence, breath steaming through the cold dawn. Among them, a former SS driver named Karl Brenner trembled beneath a thin undershirt that still bore the faint outline of a swastika patch torn away. His boots had no soles. He hadn't slept for 2 nights, and he expected to die in the morning. For weeks, rumors had passed through the barracks like smoke, that the Americans were shooting captured SS men on sight, that no mercy waited for those who had once driven Hitler's convoys. But when the sound of footsteps crunched through the frost, it wasn't a firing squad. It was a single military policeman carrying a wool blanket under his arm. The man tossed it across the muddy ground. "For you," he said simply, his voice almost indifferent. Karl hesitated, expecting a trick, but the cold drove him to reach for it. The blanket was heavy, patched together from torn uniforms, field gray, navy blue, khaki, stitched from the remnants of dead men's coats. He unfolded it, and the sight froze him harder than the wind. The largest patch, right over where his heart would rest, came from the tunic of a fallen SS officer. The American saw his expression and shrugged. "We use what's left," he said quietly, "to keep the living warm." That single sentence sank into Karl like a bullet that did not kill, but rearranged something inside. The moral world he had lived in, divided neatly into victors and enemies, Aryans and subhumans, guilt and pride, suddenly collapsed into one muddy field where death no longer cared about sides. Around him, men who once shouted "Heil" now fought for splinters of wood to feed the stove. A truck roared somewhere beyond the wire, its engine backfiring like cannon fire. The sound made the prisoners flinch. Yet, over that noise came something else. Laughter from the American tents, faint and unguarded, like the sound of a world that hadn't completely drowned in blood. Karl wrapped himself in the blanket. It smelled of smoke and sweat, but also of life. He felt its warmth seeping through the patches of enemy cloth and realized he was being kept alive by the fabric of his own ruin. That night, he dreamed not of marching boots or orders barked through megaphones, but of hands sewing pieces together under a flickering lamp, one thread at a time, turning uniforms of the dead into comfort for the living. War had taken everything from him, his name, his pride, his command. Yet, in that crude blanket, it gave him one thing back: the right to feel human again, if only for a moment. He whispered a prayer he didn't remember learning, his breath fading into the cold. Let this warmth mean something. Outside, the wind howled through the wreckage of Germany's last winter. Inside, beneath the stitched memories of fallen enemies, a man who once drove death across Europe finally began to thaw. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you watch tonight, tell us, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? The snow turned to slush by morning, and with it came the uneasy routine of captivity. American trucks growled beyond the wire, hauling supplies to the front that was already fading away. Karl Brenner stood in the mud outside a makeshift shed marked Fuel Depot, his breath mixing with the diesel fumes. It was the last place any man expected to see an SS driver again. Not chained, not humiliated, but assigned a task. An American MP named Ray Thompson, broad-shouldered and quiet-spoken, watched him with a cigarette between his teeth. He handed Karl a clipboard and a key. "You'll guard this place," he said. The interpreter, a Polish-born sergeant, blinked in disbelief. "Sir, he's SS," he muttered. Thompson didn't look up. "He knows how to burn things," he said, flicking ash onto the ground. "Let's see if he can keep something from burning." The words hung in the cold air like a judgment. Other prisoners whispered among themselves, some sneering, others afraid. In the hierarchy of guilt, the SS were untouchables. To give one responsibility was unthinkable. Yet here, under the authority of a man who once fought them, the unthinkable was happening. That afternoon, Karl walked between barrels marked high octane. He felt the stares on his back from both sides of the fence. In another life, he had guarded convoys bound for the Eastern Front, where villages burned and men screamed in languages he never learned. Now he was guarding gasoline, liquid fire, for the men who had destroyed his world. The irony gnawed at him, but so did a strange sense of duty. He worked methodically, checking seals, recording volumes, stacking jerry cans under tarps to keep the rain away. In the evenings, Thompson would stop by with his coffee tin, sometimes offering Karl a half cigarette. They spoke little, but when they did, it was about engines, not ideology. Karl found out that Thompson had been a mechanic before the war, fixing Ford trucks in Missouri. "Funny," Thompson said once, kicking the mud off his boots. "We both drove roads we didn't choose." Each day, the Americans came to refill their trucks, and each day, Karl remained silent behind the fuel pump, saluting no one. But inside, the gesture had already shifted. What had once been obedience to fear was slowly becoming obedience to decency, a habit rediscovered. At night, when the guards rotated, Karl stayed awake listening to the soft gurgle of fuel in the barrels. To him, it sounded like confession, dangerous, flammable, yet necessary. He thought of Thompson's line again. Let's see if he can keep something from burning. He realized that for the first time in years, someone had trusted him not to destroy. That trust weighed heavier than any weapon he had carried. The flames that once consumed villages now existed only in memory, but their echoes lingered in his chest like sparks refusing to die. As dawn broke and the first truck engines coughed to life, Karl stood by the depot, hands numb, heart uncertain, guarding the one thing he could no longer afford to lose: the small, fragile possibility of redemption. The camp by the Rhine looked more like a city than a prison. Rows of canvas tents stretched beyond sight, flanked by barbed wire and guard towers built from pine cut in the nearby forest. The Americans called it Camp Remagen, though the men inside whispered another name: the Factory of Contradictions. By May 1945, over 120,000 German prisoners lived here, guarded by men barely older than they were. For Karl Brenner, the former SS driver now turned fuel warden, life followed a strange rhythm. Every dawn began with the clang of mess tins, the hiss of coffee boiling in field pots, and the echo of languages colliding. English commands, German curses, Polish jokes. The war was officially over, but no one inside the wire believed it yet. The Americans treated the camp with unexpected precision. Water trucks arrived on schedule. Bread came from captured Wehrmacht bakeries. A field newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, circulated freely. Some guards even tossed old copies into the compound, and the prisoners fought over them like relics. In one headline, Karl read that Ford factories in Michigan were already shifting from tanks to tractors. It felt obscene and beautiful at once. He had been reassigned again, this time to oversee a repair shed for damaged U.S. vehicles. "You used to drive Mercedes trucks, right?" Thompson had asked. "Good. Then you can keep ours running." The irony was sharp. A German SS man restoring American machines of victory, but Karl obeyed. Each morning he checked carburetors, replaced belts, oiled gears. The sound of wrenches striking metal became the new anthem of his captivity. The gossip among prisoners was endless. Some claimed the Americans were fattening them before execution. Others swore they had seen Red Cross parcels addressed to the German Labor Corps, as if they were being repurposed for some industrial fate. Yet, a few dared to admit something else. The guards shared cigarettes, sometimes even photographs of their families. One evening, when a corporal from Texas played a harmonica near the fence, dozens of men froze mid-step. The tune, "You Are My Sunshine," drifted over the wire, and for a fleeting moment, it sounded like a lullaby from a forgotten world. In his tent, Karl kept a small notebook made from torn ration papers. Each night, he wrote fragments. Not confessions, not apologies, just fragments. "Engines never judge who drives them." Or, "Today I held a wrench instead of a rifle. It felt heavier." One afternoon, a group of new prisoners arrived from the shattered Ruhr. Among them was a former SS sergeant who sneered when he saw Karl working alongside Americans. "You think fixing their trucks will save your soul?" he spat. Karl didn't answer. He simply tightened a bolt and said, "It keeps my hands from freezing." That night, Thompson visited the shed to check progress. He watched Karl adjust a carburetor, then nodded approvingly. "You Germans," he said quietly. "You build things too well to stay broken forever." Outside, the Rhine shimmered under the moonlight, reflecting the moving silhouettes of both prisoners and guards. Two nations, still enemies on paper, were unknowingly rehearsing the mechanics of peace. And in the center of it all, surrounded by engines and silence, A man who had once driven destruction learned, slowly, how to rebuild. By summer, the war was history on paper, but not yet in the bones of those who had lived it. The camp's fences glittered under June's sunlight, and the air smelled of oil and bread, the twin symbols of work and survival. Karl Brenner's world had narrowed to a repair yard where rusting GMC trucks waited for resurrection. He moved among them like a ghost of his old self, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with grease. The sound of engines starting was no longer fearsome. It was proof that life could still move forward. One morning, Sergeant Ray Thompson brought him a new challenge, a wrecked GMC that had been abandoned near Remagen Bridge when the Allies crossed the Rhine. Its hood was dented, radiator cracked, ignition dead. "See what you can do," Thompson said. "It's been silent too long." Karl spent 3 days and nights working on that engine. He scavenged parts from scrap heaps, straightened the bent fan blades with a hammer, and polished the carburetor until it caught sunlight like glass. Each turn of the wrench felt like turning away from something inside him. The drills, the slogans, the blind obedience. In the evenings, Thompson sometimes stopped by, crouching near the open hood. He would light his cigarette and watch without speaking. On the third night, when Karl poured the last drops of fuel into the tank, Thompson handed him the key. "Start it," he said. The engine coughed, choked, and then roared alive. A deep mechanical heartbeat shaking the ground. The noise made prisoners turn their heads, startled by the echo of machinery that once meant conquest. Thompson smiled faintly. "That's the first sound of peace I've heard in years," he murmured. Karl stood there, staring at the exhaust curling into the sky. For a brief second, he imagined his old Mercedes truck in the same position, carrying soldiers eastward. The memory collided with the present. The same hands, the same craft, but reversed in purpose. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, practical, built from bolts and oil. Yet it meant everything. In his notebook that night, Karl wrote, "Engines and men are alike. They stop when hatred chokes the valves. They run when someone believes they still can." Around them, the camp had begun to shift tone. The guards no longer shouted as often. Some prisoners were released to work in local farms. Even the Americans seemed exhausted by their own victory. A rumor spread that Thompson might be transferred home soon. When Karl overheard it, something tightened in his chest. A fear he hadn't known since childhood. The fear of being left alone with unfinished redemption. The next morning, he oiled the engine one last time, careful and deliberate. The sky above the Rhine glowed orange with sunrise, and the repaired truck gleamed like a promise. For the first time in his life, Karl realized that power could exist without domination, that strength could be quiet and generous. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked toward Thompson's tent, and thought, "This is what it means to drive again, not to conquer, but to continue." By December 1945, the camp's fences had begun to sag under their own rust. The Rhine shimmered under sheets of thin ice, and even the guards seemed more like weary workers than victors. The war crimes tribunals had begun far away in Nuremberg, but here at Camp Remagen, life revolved around trucks, shovels, and breadlines. Every man sought a reason to keep existing, and for Karl Brenner, that reason came disguised as labor. The Americans had created a reconstruction division, a program to use skilled prisoners in rebuilding what the war had shattered. By July, over 10,000 captured vehicles had been repaired by German hands for U.S. convoys across Europe. Karl was promoted to foreman of a small group of mechanics, 5 Germans and 1 Italian who had deserted Mussolini's army. Their orders were simple: restore, repaint, and refit the trucks until they looked ready to serve peace instead of war. It was during those long summer days that Karl felt the strangest transformation of all. Each truck he repaired carried traces of a system he once believed eternal: stamped steel, serial numbers, discipline. But as he reassembled engines, he began to understand that machines were innocent, that only men decided what direction they moved. He treated every gear and bolt like a prayer whispered to absolve himself. Thompson often visited the workshop, no longer with a pistol, but with a clipboard and a smile that came easier. One afternoon, he watched Karl teaching a younger prisoner how to replace a crankshaft. "You run this place better than my men back home," Thompson said. Karl didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. That evening, a rumor spread through the camp. A new order required all remaining SS members to be separated and interrogated again. Panic rippled through the barracks. Men tore off insignias, burned documents, begged guards for mercy. Karl sat in silence by the truck he'd just repaired, tracing his name on the metal hood. He knew he could lie, but he also knew Thompson had written his record himself. Reliable mechanic, keeps order, shows no hostility. When Thompson came by that night, Karl asked, almost pleading, "Why trust me? You know what I was." Thompson leaned against the truck, lighting a cigarette. "I know what you're trying to be," he said simply. For Karl, that single line cut deeper than any verdict. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement of the effort to change. The realization was heavier than the guilt he'd carried because it demanded he live up to it every day. One snowy morning, Karl shared coffee with Thompson beside the still-running engine. They spoke of their families. Thompson's sister in Boston, who wrote about ration coupons and jazz records, Karl's wife in Kassel searching for milk for their son. The two men listened to the hum of the motor and the falling snow, and for a moment, the entire world felt repairable. Would you, watching from your own corner of history, have done the same? Would you accept kindness from the hand that defeated you? Tell me in the comments below. Your answer says more about peace than any treaty ever could. The snow returned with a vengeance in February 1946. Wind clawed at the tents, tearing ropes loose and driving flakes through every opening. The prisoners huddled together for warmth, sharing breath and silence. Karl Brenner was now the man everyone turned to when things broke, engines, stoves, or spirits. The Americans had learned to trust his work. The Germans, grudgingly, had learned to trust his steadiness. That week, a new team of mechanics arrived from another camp, among them a tall black sergeant named Joseph Carter from Alabama. He spoke little German, but carried an ease that unsettled the old hierarchy. Carter had been assigned to oversee repairs in Karl's shed. The first time he entered, the noise stopped. Dozens of German eyes turned toward him, some curious, others dark with inherited contempt. Karl froze too, the old reflex of indoctrination whispering poison from the past. Carter ignored it. He took off his gloves, inspected a gearbox, and said evenly, "This one will need new bearings." His tone carried no anger, only experience. As he worked, his hands moved with a rhythm that silenced prejudice. Karl found himself watching the way the man wiped grease from his palms, precise and calm, the same way he used to watch senior SS officers command attention. But this authority came from skill, not fear. Days passed. They repaired engines side by side. Sometimes, Carter hummed blues tunes under his breath, the melody low and steady like a heartbeat. One afternoon, as they finished tightening the last bolts on a transmission, Carter pinned a small American flag to the tool rack, a corner of color against the gray shed. No one said anything. The air thickened, an invisible challenge hanging between the two men. Later, Karl found himself standing before that flag long after the others had left. The symbol that once represented his enemy now fluttered slightly in the draft, no longer threatening, just present. Carter walked back in quietly and saw him staring. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then Carter extended his hand, rough and warm. "Doesn't matter who built the truck," he said, "as long as it runs." Karl hesitated only a second before shaking it. The contact was brief but electric, the collision of two histories that should never have met except in hatred. And yet, in that moment, there was nothing left of ideology, only the shared fatigue of men who wanted to keep machines, and maybe people, from falling apart. That night, Karl couldn't sleep. He thought of what it meant for a black American soldier, a man his old beliefs would have condemned as lesser, to teach him dignity through work. It felt like the universe had twisted every hierarchy of power to expose the truth. Would you, if you had lived then, have taken that handshake? Could you look at someone your world had told you to despise and see not an enemy, but a craftsman, a human being? History asks, and so does this story. Outside, the repaired trucks gleamed under the moonlight, lined like silent witnesses. Above the shed door, that small flag still hung, faded, oil-stained, but undefeated. September 1946. The war had ended more than a year ago, yet the roads across Germany still smelled of diesel, dust, and broken memories. The last groups of prisoners were being processed for release. Among them stood Karl Brenner, his belongings reduced to a blanket, a notebook, and a faded work permit signed by Sergeant Ray Thompson. When his name was called, he stepped forward, no longer in a uniform, just in an American-issued jacket 2 sizes too big, the same color as the trucks he had spent months repairing. He boarded a train headed north toward Bremerhaven. The car was filled with men like him, once soldiers, now displaced souls. Outside, the landscape rolled past. Burned villages, skeletal factories, and the stubborn green of fields beginning to heal. In the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, he heard echoes of the engines he had rebuilt, each rotation a reminder that motion itself was survival. When the train stopped at Bremen, the Red Cross handed out bread, coffee, and small slips of paper with addresses of displaced families. Karl accepted his without a word. He had not heard from his wife since early spring. All he knew was that Castle still stood, barely. In the cargo yard near the docks, a row of decommissioned U.S. trucks awaited shipment. Karl paused when he saw one familiar vehicle, a GMC painted olive green, its serial number beginning with the same digits as the one he had restored months before. He climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked, but the smell of oil and metal was the same. He reached under the seat and felt something hard, a small, rusted identification tag. He brushed away the grime and read the words stamped into the metal. Private Ray Thompson, Military Police, 99th Division. The world seemed to hold still. For a long moment, he sat in silence, the tag in his palm, the ghost of an engine humming in memory. Then he pulled a scrap of paper from his notebook and wrote a single line in shaky English. "Your truck still runs. So do the things you taught me." Weeks later, in a small post office near Kassel, he mailed it to the address engraved faintly on the tag, Missouri, USA. Whether it ever arrived, he would never know. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself with American aid and German labor. Factories reopened, and highways filled again with vehicles built by hands that once served destruction. Karl found work as a driver for a construction company, carrying materials instead of soldiers. On cold nights, he still used that same patched blanket, its seams frayed but intact. He sometimes wondered if Thompson ever read his letter, or if the tag had become just another relic of a war that taught men to destroy, then forced them to learn how to live again. In the end, it did not matter. Somewhere across the ocean, a man had trusted him. Somewhere in Germany, an old truck still started on the first turn. Between them, across silence and time, humanity had survived in the smallest of engines. History often remembers the explosions, the flags raised, the nations rebuilt, the treaties signed. Yet, the real transformation happens in silence, between two men standing beside a broken machine, between the act of trust and the moment it is accepted. The story of Karl Brenner and Sergeant Ray Thompson is not one of triumph or forgiveness neatly granted. It is the fragile anatomy of peace, assembled one bolt, one gesture, one heartbeat at a time. In 1945, 3.4 million Germans became prisoners of the Western Allies. Statistics tell us that 98% returned home alive. But what those numbers hide are the smaller miracles. The cigarettes shared across fences, the blankets patched from enemy uniforms, the unspoken agreements between those who once tried to kill each other. Every repaired truck, every mended boot, every word left unsaid built a foundation for the Europe that followed. Karl's journey from driver of destruction to caretaker of engines mirrored the rebirth of his country. He had been trained to see the world in black and white, victory or death. But through grease-stained days and cold nights, he learned that survival depended not on domination, but on cooperation. He discovered that the most enduring victories are not shouted. They are whispered through kindness too quiet to be reported in any war diary. Somewhere in Missouri, perhaps an old sergeant once received a letter with a few simple words, "Your truck still runs." Perhaps he smiled and said nothing. Perhaps he showed it to no one. But that act, invisible to history books, meant that two men had managed to carry decency through the ruins of ideology. War had taught them how to destroy. Peace taught them how to endure. And between those two lessons lies the real story of the 20th century. That even in the wreckage of moral collapse, humanity can find a way to start the engine again.